Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Corbin, and I serve with the marketing team at Lexham Press. In the light of everything going on with the spread of the coronavirus and the experience of working from home, we thought this might be a good time to introduce some of our authors to folks on social media. And what better way than through video conferencing technology that has become a part of everyone's lives, which I'm sure you all understand. I'm delighted today to interview Ron Dart, the editor of the new volume from Lexham, Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective. Ron, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, a joy to be with you.
Excellent. So for the uninitiated, who is Jordan Peterson and why does he matter?
Well, probably certainly since 2016, he has emerged more nationally and internationally on the stage as probably one of the most controversial public intellectuals. And so anyone who's minimally alert to what's happening in culture cannot miss the presence of Jordan Peterson on the stage, engaging both the politically correct progressive left and obviously challenging elements of the conservative alt-right. And so he walks a very delicate and thoughtful middle way between extremes which tend to polarize and become very tribal.
That's great. And how did you first come across Jordan Peterson?
Well, I'd heard of Peterson. I mean, there's the whole backstory to Peterson before 2016, in which he played a very significant role in TV Ontario in dealing with some of the hot button issues which tend to divide people. So there is that backstory in which he's been front stage at University of Toronto, worked teaching in the psychology department, engaging some of the more troubling ethical issues of our time. But it was with 216, I had a whole group of students increasingly became quite interested in Jordan Peterson. For them, he played a very significant role either in alerting them to Christianity or bringing some of them back to Christianity. And anytime you have someone playing that role publicly and having an impact on the broader public and students in particular, I thought, boy, I should start doing a little more research and thinking about his obvious influence.
That's great. So the book here, there's a lot of really interesting chapters, kind of covering different aspects of kind of the things that Peterson encounters and talks about. Your chapter, chapter 4, is called Myth, Memoricide, and Jordan Peterson, and I found that to be a really interesting chapter for a number of reasons. But you say on page 73, Jordan Peterson's turn to myth as a way of explaining the human condition and journey means he stands in a long lineage. Those who ignore this deeper mythic way of knowing and being in Peterson's thinking and presentations miss the deeper structure and wells from which he draws. This might be a surprise for some. Those who probably know his thought probably know a little bit about this, but what do you mean there, and what does Peterson mean by myth, and how does that inform Peterson's corpus? So not just the 12 Rules for Life, but also Maps of Meaning and those things as well.
Yeah, as you say, Maps of Meaning is his big magnum opus, written in the published in the 90s anyway. There's often a misunderstanding when we hear the word myth. Many people, when they hear myth, they think of illusion, fantasy, lie, dishonesty, whereas myth in the classical sense, certainly as articulated by Plato, moving through the Christian tradition as embodied in such great mythic epics of Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter series, many of these. Myth in that sense is eternal truths wrapped in the garments of a story or a narrative. And myth offers people in a period of time in which sort of the maps of meaning have become so fragmented and the markings on the trail have become so dissipated, and which then leaves people rudderless in trying to make sense of human identity, how they live their life, how they make sense of their all too human journey. So the great myths of the past say there's a structure in the human soul and in society. And if we don't heed that structure, there are consequences to face in our lives. And so what Peterson does, because most people, I use the word memoricide, meaning most of us have no memory anymore. It's the nature of a certain type of progressive liberalism that as we move forward, we're brighter, we're more thoughtful, and the past just doesn't have the stone quarried wisdom that we do. In fact, the great myths of civilizations, when we ignore them, they do lead to dire consequences for the soul, for society, for communities. And so you tell these stories, and so what Peterson does, he starts with more popular myths that, because most people don't have the history, that's the Memora side, so most of them would become acquainted with that through something like Walt Disney stories. So whether it's Pinocchio or, you know, whether it's Lion King or whether it's Frozen or any of these,
Yeah.
and then he'll move from there, or things like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Chronicles, and then he'll move to the great myths or stories as embodied in the Bible and other great civilizations as well. And so by this he restores, he gives people back the markings or cairns by which they then can navigate.
And one of the things about your chapter that I found particularly interesting was a section where you kind of compare Peter Pan and Pinocchio and kind of explore some of the ways in which how those myths operate within Peterson's thought. So maybe just here briefly, you can kind of outline some of those differences and some of those things that to kind of show what it is that Peterson does whenever he's using myth.
Yes, so most people who haven't been exposed to the great myths of, say, Roman or Greek or Indian or Christian tradition will have been exposed to popular myths like Peter Pan or Pinocchio. And so Peterson will focus on these, what people know or have seen growing up or taken in with their mother's milk as a part of their own life story. So Peter Pan is really the story of the little boy and the lost boys who never want to grow up. So in that particular myth, you have Captain Hook and the crocodile, which is time. And Captain Hook has again been bitten again by time. He's a bitter old man. And that said, he's lost to Kronos, time, like Kronos in Greek myth eats its children, time eats its children. And so Peter Pan and the little boys see this angry, bitter old person, Captain Hook, who has been disappointed by time, betrayed by time. And the reaction to that is, well, I'm never going to grow up. I'm going to elude the demands of time by remaining a little boy forever. And so all his little lost boys never want to face into the challenges of time and the challenges of mature and growing up, and even the way he sees women. So you have Tinkerbell. She's essentially what Peterson will call almost a pornographic fantasy, versus Wendy, a real woman he doesn't want to seriously engage. And so Peter Pan, in one sense, embodies a lot of what Peterson will argue, a lot of males today who remain in a state of infancy, in their 20s and their 30s, and they don't know how to mature in a meaningful way. Now, on the other hand, you get the story of Pinocchio, who's very much dangled, as any child is when they're growing up, by the threads of their parents who want them to grow up and what they see as the best and most important, mature way possible. But Pinocchio's still a little wooden boy. When he finally breaks or cuts the threads from Geppetto, he then, because he has no discerning ability, goes into Pleasure Island. He gets taken in by all sorts of shrewd and conniving people, promising him happiness and fulfillment and a variety of things. But there's the blue fairy who's like Grace, and you have the obviously the conscience of Jiminy Cricket, constantly warning that this is not the way to go. And so the story is the process, again, of growing up and becoming, and really at the end, he's willing to give his life for his father, and then he becomes a living human being. And so these two myths are contrasted, the one of Peter Pan and the one of Pinocchio, the one who's willing to pay the sacrificial price of caring for others, and the other wants to remain narcissistic and indulgent. And there's consequences. One remains in a state of perpetual infancy and immaturity. The other becomes a living human being in that sense. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. That's great. And so my immediate kind of follow-up question from that is, so that kind of this idea of myth obviously is informing the way that Peterson reads texts. So how does that specifically interface with his view, not only of what the Bible is, maybe, but also too in terms of his reading of the Bible as well?
Yeah, so there's been two, broadly speaking, traditions of viewing the Bible. One is increasingly a secular approach, that the Bible's a dated text. It's of no relevance for us today. It might have been useful in the lower level of human development and evolution, but we bypass that. On the other hand, there tends to be more of a Protestant Reformed read, in which the literal, grammatical, historical, textual is foundational to understanding what the text reads. Now, in the classical Christian tradition, there's 6 layers of reading any text. And one is the mythic, in that, yes, these things we can squabble over whether they're historically true or not. But the more existential approach to the text is, what do they actually mean for us and decision makings and knowing the self? So the Adam-Eve myth, for example, the tree symbolically in mythic traditions is of the soul. And within that, there's certain fruit you don't pick, and there's consequences of picking certain fruit. Others, great fruit on the tree of the soul, enjoy it and delight in it. But if you pick the wrong fruit, you lose your image and the divine image and likeness of God. And then you're, as what Steinbeck said, you live east of Eden. And myth helps people to find their way back home again to their true self in that sense. And so what Peterson does, he mines all sorts of myths, whether it's the Noah myth, the Cain-Abel myth, the order chaos myth in Genesis. And so his interest is less, for example, in the early chapters of Genesis. Well, when, young earth creation, evolution, his question is, no, there's a deeper philosophic story here that we need to mind. It's a mother lode, and that brings you into a classical Christian tradition of more the mythic and the mystical approach that you'll find in the mothers and fathers of the patristic era from the 2nd to about the 7th centuries. So if you follow the portal of Peterson's mythic approach, you're led eventually back into the early Christian interpretation of how they approach the text. I've just been teaching a course with some of my upper level students on Augustine's City of God. And when Augustine approaches texts, he's constantly looking at a fourfold level. So, for example, the latter part of the Confessions, he doesn't look at Genesis and young earth dating. He wants to know what's the mythic truth or city of God. He's constantly probing layered ways of reading the Hebrew canon or Old Testament. So it's a hermeneutic that if people are on the Protestant sort of Reformed right, they don't know what to do with the mythic read. The seculars don't know what to do when he takes the Bible seriously.
Well, that's what I was just I was just wondering too, is that he provides a kind of foil for, especially for secularism, because of the way in which he's viewing kind of these deep structures within texts and things like that, especially the Bible, while at the same time kind of blowing up categories for what people might understand for how one ought to read the Bible, or how one typically does read the Bible. So in that sense, he is providing kind of a foil to those kind of more secular types, but then also too, for people who are Christians, they maybe don't know what to do with them, because there's some parts of it that seem like an ally, but maybe at other times feels like it's not. So this book, the subtitle is A Christian Perspective. So what are we to do with Jordan Peterson's Christianity, or maybe even Christ hauntedness, the way in which he kind of is constantly going to the Bible as a way of mining these stories, but yet maybe himself is not maybe not a Christian. What would you say to that?
Well, I would see him as Virgil in Dante's Divine Comedy, that takes you to Beatrice, and Bernard of Clairvaux, or in the classical Christian tradition, just of natural theology in that sense. So in the early Christianity, they were deeply sensitive to the insights of Plato and Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero and the Celtic tradition. And if you just fast forward that to today, he blends, and I think this is part of his draw. There's a sort of a hunger and a longing for the great truths, but there's also the doubting side, the skepticism, and he lives in this tension between longing and doubt, which in one sense is a healthy tension. He doesn't go as far down the doubt as cynicism and sort of the ideology of agnosticism. On the other hand, he's not going to take certitude without doubt. So in that sense, he's a doubting Thomas. He's helpful as a Virgil. And he's bilingual in the sense, people who only know how to think biblically, they don't know how to relate to the broader culture, which is asking questions in a way that are not easily answered with simple little verses from the Bible. He's asking philosophical and theological questions. And he knows the language of his culture, but he's feeling towards, the bigger sacred issues as well. And so he lives in a variety of tensions. In that sense, I think he, as best, helps people grow up and mature into how you live with difficult tensions and questions, and how myth can contribute to that. Like 2 chapters in the book deal with the Bible, for example, in his lectures in Genesis when in Toronto, and then another looks at the Platonic element in Plato and memory in that ontological sense.
That's great. So I'd like to take a slight turn here. So one of the things that I feel like people know him for is his criticisms of things like postmodernism, Marxism, neo-Marxism, identity politics, critical theory, etc. And there are several chapters in here to talk about things like freedom of speech, and also talking about kind of the totalitarianism of certain types of these things on the left. For these categories, I feel like a lot of times people have misunderstandings about what they are. So I would actually love for you to maybe explain what these things are, and then also why it is that Peterson views them as so inimical to culture and to especially within the academic sphere.
Yeah, so there's a variety of approaches to that. So things like elements of the postmodern and late modern thought basically hold a position. There is neither right nor wrong, but there are just perspectives. So things like hermeneutical generosity. The dilemma is that you just get fragmentation and no ethical orienting. So that's one side of liberalism, which essentially deconstructs any meta-narrative in any meaningful sense. The other side is and he's very suspicious of that, and this is where myth comes in, because there is a structure. So elements of postmodernity are post-meta-narrative, post-structural. There is nothing to orient by other than our own perceived identity, and that can change. It's a liquid reality. It can change depending on how we choose to define it. The other is the reaction to that, what sometimes we'll call cultural Marxism, in which he's critiquing. There's the economic Marxism back of that, which argues there's a lens through which we interpret reality, and that is in terms of power, powerlessness. For Marx, it's the bourgeois and the proletariat. Now, if you move away from the Marxist economic theory, then you've just got the lens of power and powerlessness. So whoever's the victim is de facto in the right, and whoever's in power is de facto an oppressor of some sort. Now, Peterson wants to deconstruct that very simplistic interpretive hermeneutic by which we then favor what is seen as the victim, and then we demonize who is seen as the oppressor. And that's applied to things like race and gender and identity and a whole range of issues. So he's questioning a certain epistemology that simplifies, and it's like, to use the image he sometimes uses in Greek myth, the Cyclops, who is just one eye. So what you have is a reductionistic epistemology going at work in that cultural Marxism and postmodernism. And now he's been criticized by certain more sophisticated postmodernists and cultural Marxists, arguing he is simplifying things. But there's also truth in what he's saying. Anyone who's taught at university or who is engaged in some of these cultural issues or at the political level knows they're, when fleshed out, actually quite true. In terms of people interpret issues it's a form of sort of secular Puritanism. We're the pure ones. So rather than religious Puritanism, we're the pure ones. We understand how to make sense of justice, injustice. At its crudest level, you get the social justice warriors, who really simplify things, and I mean they're sort of stunted intellectually, but they have the sense that they're right, and if you differ with them, the rhetorically things they can say, the things they do, are highly problematic. And so Peterson's very concerned with this. I mean, he has a history of being concerned with larger totalitarianism, whether it's Russia or China or Nazism or fascism, but there's a more subtle form of totalitarianism culturally he's concerned about that silences questioning and critical thinking. And in that sense, he's just a good classical liberal of the Lockean tradition, of the Mill tradition. And the irony is that many, the liberal Sanhedrin of either the postmodern or the politic turn on him without realizing that he is just asking them to think critically about themselves, not about others. And in that sense, he's just a good classical liberal that you would think anybody with a university education at a minimal level would say we should only be other critical, but if we don't know how to be self-critical, then you're moving in the direction of various forms of totalitarianism.
And so it's interesting then, because I feel like that's where a lot of people kind of think about him, maybe from a popular level. That's kind of the area in which that he's most thought about. But at the same time, it's interesting to see how those ideas, concepts of myth, like you're talking about with those deeper structures and those things, still at play. That's kind of that he's allergic to that because of the way in which it goes against the grain of reality. It goes against he talks about being with a capital B. That it's kind of going against those sorts of things. So it's interesting to see the cohesion in his thought that goes beyond just kind of a visceral reaction to something like identity politics or critical theory or something like that. So last question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, there's a very deep philosophical element to Peterson, and this is what our book tries to explore beyond the sort of public confrontational, video, interviews, public engagement. People only see that. That's really a portal, and it should take them into something more substantive, and that's what our book attempts to do. And there's no book out yet on Peterson and the Christian perspective.
That's right. And so kind of last question. I'll kind of make it a two-parter, one on like a marketing level, and one just kind of as like a final way of thinking about Peterson. If you had to distill the main reasons why people are drawn to Jordan Peterson, what would you say? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, why should people read Myth and Meaning? Let's do this. Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective.
Yeah, two good questions. I think people are drawn to him for two reasons. The progressives, because they see him as a threat to the Sanhedrin, their orthodoxy, liberal orthodoxy, and they're trying to, like Annas and Caiaphas, defend the liberal orthodox tradition. So they see him as a threat. And he basically says the emperor has no clothes on. I think there's different types of conservatives which are drawn to him. I think he articulates that there is meaning in an age and an ethos in which meaning is a construction. We make it up as we go along, and we can change it like we change clothes. He says there are stories that, in fact, if we ignore them, we ignore them to our peril. And so for people who are disoriented, he essentially says, here's a map. And this map, if you understand it properly and know how to decode it in a meaningful way, it's going to lead to a substantive and meaningful life lived. And so I think that's appeal to a certain element of the population who are very disoriented, who have no memory, they don't know how to, and who say have seen these fairy tales, but they've never known how to, they're interesting little fairy tales, but they have no relevance for their life. He basically says, no, they're existentially relevant. Internalize them and you'll be a different person, which in a more popular way he does in his book Rules for Living, which tends to be a little more populist. What was the second question then?
Second question was, why should people read this book, your book, Myth and Meaning, the book you edited, Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective?
Well, I think hopefully it will give people a much more well-rounded understanding of who Peterson is. So when they either watch videos or hear about him, they can come at it in a more mature, thoughtful manner in that way. For people who are coming from a Christian background and not quite sure knowing how to react to Jordan Peterson, I think in some ways this will give them a key to interpret him in hopefully a more meaningful and judicious and discerning manner, to know where to say yes, where to say no, where he contributes, where he's the Virgil, as I mentioned earlier, that can point the way forward. And so I think for Christians, it's a way of approaching, hopefully in an appreciative but kindly critical, questioning way, the importance of Peterson on the stage. And for people who don't come from a Christian background, hopefully the variety of essays take one in a direction where they're exploring the big themes of, science and religion, secularity and the sacred, diverse ways of reading the biblical tradition, myth and meaning. Peterson is a humanist in the best sense of the word. There's certain forms of Christianity that humanism is a dirty word. But in fact, one of the essays, people who've read Kierkegaard, Peterson and Kierkegaard. So it's sort of a Renaissance book of which Peterson is a Renaissance thinker. So we've tried to internalize his approach, multidisciplinary, honor that, and then offer a text with diverse authors who embody that more Renaissance approach to thinking and what it could mean for us today.
Awesome. Well, Ron, thanks so much. As a reminder to everyone who's watching, if you have any more questions or want to learn more about the book, I would recommend everyone to go to the LexhamPress.com page to learn more about this book, Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective. Ron, thanks so much for sitting down with me.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me a few minutes to say something about the book.